An elderly black woman walked into a prestigious bank in Charleston. Her clothes were worn. Her hands were trembling. And when she said 5 chilling words, "This bank belongs to me," the entire lobby erupted in laughter. But what they didn't know was that she wasn't just another homeless passerby. She was the bank's true founder. The woman they erased. The name they buried. What happened next? It shattered generations of lies. Security reached for their guns. Managers scrambled to control the damage. But nothing could stop the storm she brought with her, not this time. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's a reckoning. A legacy rewritten by the woman they tried to forget. If you believe the truth always finds a way, then stay with us. Like the video, drop a in the comments, and subscribe now, because what you're about to hear will shake you to your core. The glass doors of Hawthorne Federal Bank, located on a quiet street corner in Charleston, South Carolina, slid open with a mechanical hum. A cool blast of air drifted out onto the sidewalk, brushing against the summer heat. But it wasn't the air that made everyone stop and stare, it was the woman who stepped inside. She was elderly, black, and carried with her the silent dignity of someone who had endured far too much. Her gray hair was pulled back in a loose bun, thin silver strands falling freely along her weathered cheeks. Her coat, a thick brown wool blend, was patched in several places, stained by time and hardship. Her skirt dragged slightly at her ankles, torn at the hem. Her shoes, decades old, were frayed at the soles, and every step she took seemed measured, deliberate. Over her shoulder, she carried a large, worn-out canvas bag. It was faded to a dull olive color, it seemed stretched and strained from years of use. People in the lobby began to murmur. A middle-aged woman in heels and a white business suit quickly clutched her Michael Kors purse and took a step back. A young male teller leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Did she get lost? Maybe she thought this was a shelter or something." His coworker rolled his eyes, glancing back at the woman with barely concealed contempt. What a mess. But the elderly woman didn't react. She walked with quiet resolve, her eyes dark and steady, scanning the space slowly. There was no shame in her expression. No confusion. Only calm. She came to a stop in the center of the marble lobby and raised her chin slightly. Then she spoke, clear, steady, and just loud enough to be heard. "This bank belongs to me." The words fell into the air like a pin drop. At first, there was confusion. Then smirking. Then a wave of open laughter rippled through the bank. Someone in the corner chuckled, "What is she even talking about?" A man in a navy suit said under his breath, "People like her always want something they don't deserve." The security guard, a tall, broad white man named Derek Whitmore, a former Marine, straightened near the entrance. His hand instinctively moved toward the pistol on his belt, more out of reflex than threat. His face was unreadable, but his jaw clenched. The old woman didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the weight of her bag, her fingers gripping the strap tighter. Derek took 2 steps forward and said firmly, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and leave. You can't just come in here shouting things." But she didn't shout. She just repeated it. "This bank belongs to me." The crowd erupted in louder laughter. Customers exchanged mocking glances. The wealthy clientele of downtown Charleston weren't used to disruptions, especially not ones that looked like this. But as she reached slowly into her canvas bag, her hands moving with the care of someone about to reveal something sacred, the entire atmosphere began to change. The mocking faded. The whispers stopped. And for reasons no one yet understood, every eye in the room turned toward her. Because in that moment, it became clear. She wasn't here to beg. She was here to reveal a truth. One they weren't ready for. The laughter inside the marble-walled lobby of Hawthorne Federal Bank began to fade, replaced by a charged, uneasy silence. The woman still standing calmly in the center tightened her grip on the strap of her canvas bag. Her presence, once dismissed as a nuisance, now unsettled the room. The security guard, Derek Whitmore, took another deliberate step toward her. He was a man who prided himself on control. His buzz-cut hair, perfectly pressed uniform, and military posture radiated authority. But something about this woman's stillness made him hesitate. His fingers rested just above the grip of his holstered sidearm, a subconscious threat not yet acted upon. "Ma'am," Derek said again, voice firmer now, "I'm asking you one last time. Leave. Before this becomes a problem." But the woman didn't move. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, looked not at Derek but straight ahead, toward the main counter, where the bank manager stood. Behind that counter was Connor Hastings, a man in his early 40s with slick blonde hair, a crisp navy suit, and eyes the color of ice. Connor had built his career on professionalism and precision. In the upper circles of Charleston's banking elite, he was known for his sharp judgment and unshakable calm. Now, he stood frozen behind the mahogany desk, watching the scene unfold. The woman's words had thrown a wrench into his meticulously ordered morning. Her defiance wasn't part of the routine. Connor motioned subtly toward Derek, a nonverbal order to handle it. Derek took that as his cue and stepped closer. His boots clicked on the polished floor, echoing sharply through the lobby. "Enough games, lady. Let's go. This isn't a shelter or a charity event." The woman slowly turned her head to face him. There was no fear in her eyes. No anger, either. Just something deeper, something that made Derek's breath hitch for half a second. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she said. Her voice was quiet but unwavering, as if carved from stone. "I came to take back what this bank stole from me, over 50 years ago." Her words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripple was instant. Connor's smirk faded slightly. The tellers who had been whispering now stood silently behind their counters. The customers, once entertained, began exchanging nervous glances. No one laughed anymore. Connor Hastings stepped out from behind the counter. He adjusted his cuffs as he walked, his expression carefully composed. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, clicked against the floor with sharp authority. When he reached the woman, he offered a polite but cold smile. "Ma'am," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. This bank has belonged to the Lansbury family for generations. Since long before I was born. Perhaps you're confusing it with another institution." "I'm not confused," the woman replied. Slowly, she placed the canvas bag on the marble floor. Her hands moved with reverence, as if the bag carried more than just documents, perhaps memories, burdens, even pieces of her soul. "I can prove everything. Right here. Right now." Derek's hand tensed on his belt. His body language screamed discomfort. "Don't make this worse, ma'am. You need to leave." But she didn't even look at him. Instead, she bent down, her old fingers carefully unfastening the flap of the bag. The crowd leaned forward, pulled by a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and something else, dread. "I've waited long enough," she said. "Everything I need to say is in here." She slowly peeled back the flap of the bag, revealing a stack of yellowed, fragile papers tucked between faded leather bindings. The air seemed to still. Connor's gaze dropped to the documents. Derek took a single step back. And for the first time, no one in the lobby spoke. The woman hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued. She hadn't threatened anyone. Yet the weight of her presence now hung over the entire room like a storm cloud ready to break. And still she hadn't even begun. The elderly woman stood motionless as the lobby of Hawthorne Federal Bank held its collective breath. Every eye was fixed on the weathered canvas bag at her feet and the faded stack of papers she had just revealed. The overhead lights reflected softly off the brittle yellowed pages, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. She reached down slowly, lifting the top document with delicate care. Her fingers trembled not from fear, but from the weight of memory. "I kept this," she said, holding the page in both hands, "because I knew one day, I'd need to prove who I was. And what you all took from me. The room was still. Even Derek Whitmore, the bank security guard, who had moments ago been ready to escort her out, now hesitated. His jaw was tight, and his hand had loosened slightly from his holster. At the counter, Connor Hastings, the bank manager, narrowed his eyes, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He took a hesitant step forward. "What is that?" he asked, voice level but skeptical. The woman turned slightly to face him. "This," she said, lifting the paper higher, "is the founding ledger of this bank. From 1962. My name is on it. I built this bank with my own hands." Gasps rippled through the room. A couple near the ATM exchanged looks. A teller at the far end leaned forward, trying to see more clearly. The older woman's voice didn't rise, but its quiet strength made everyone lean in. "My name," she said, "is Evelyn May Carter. I started this institution. I laid its foundation. But when I was no longer convenient, when my presence became inconvenient to your history, you erased me." Connor blinked, trying to maintain composure. "That's a serious claim, ma'am. There's no record of anyone named Carter in our founding documents. This bank's lineage traces back to the Lansbury family and their private trust. Everyone knows that." Evelyn didn't flinch. She gently bent down and pulled out another item from the bag, a thick leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age. Embossed faintly on the front, almost worn away, were the faded words, "Hawthorne Bank Ledger, 1962. Holding it with reverence, she opened it to a marked page, flipping with the practiced precision of someone who had done it countless times before. The ink had faded, but the signatures were still visible. Evelyn May Carter. John Lansbury. Side by side. "I was his business partner," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "I brought the capital. I brought the vision. He brought the connections. We were supposed to be equals." Connor leaned forward. His face, which had held a confident smirk just moments ago, now showed a flicker of doubt. Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. He couldn't stand the thought of a black woman running a bank. So he conspired with others. They changed the narrative. Falsified documents. They told the world that I was unstable. That I had never been part of it. They buried my name. She placed the ledger carefully on the nearest customer service table, open to the page of signatures. Then she stepped back. "See for yourself." Connor hesitated, then approached with visible tension. He picked up the ledger with both hands, his fingers stiff and deliberate. He began to read. The room had gone absolutely silent except for the soft sound of pages turning and the breath of people around him. Customers, employees, even Derek, the guard, now stood still, watching. Connor's face changed as he scanned the signatures. His eyes moved rapidly, searching for contradiction, anything to disprove what she had said. But the deeper he looked, the more his expression began to tighten. A small drop of sweat formed at his temple. His hand shook slightly as he reached the bottom of the page. "It can't be," he murmured, barely above a whisper. Evelyn remained still. Her gaze was firm, her presence unshakable. She had carried this truth for over 5 decades alone. But now, at last, it had begun to speak for itself. As Connor Hastings stared down at the yellowed ledger, his face drained of color. The unmistakable signature Evelyn May Carter sat beside John Lansbury's, clear as day despite the faded ink. His grip on the book tightened. The name didn't just appear there, it belonged there. Behind him, Derek Whitmore, the security guard, watched the manager closely. His stern jaw clenched, no longer out of arrogance, but uncertainty. The usual confidence in Derek's posture gave way to a subtle tension. He took a small step back, as if subconsciously distancing himself from what he had once thought was under control. Evelyn stood still, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes calm. Not defiant, not bitter, just deeply rooted, like a tree that had survived too many storms to be swayed by one more. The silence in the bank lobby stretched until it felt like the air itself had thickened. Then came the shift. In the corner, a pair of tellers, Jessica and Mark, whispered quietly, their previous amusement gone. "Did she say she helped found the bank?" Jessica asked under her breath. Mark nodded, looking visibly rattled. "That's her name, it's in the book." Near the line of customers, a woman who had clutched her purse earlier now looked down, a touch of shame crossing her face. A man in a polo shirt muttered, "If this is true, this changes everything." Evelyn's voice broke through the murmurs. "For over 50 years, I've been ignored. I've knocked on doors. Written letters. Filed petitions. No one listened. No one cared. They told me it was a fantasy. That I must have imagined it." She turned her gaze to Connor, who still hadn't spoken. But it wasn't imagination. It was theft. It was erasure. Connor finally spoke, though his voice cracked slightly as he tried to maintain the authoritative tone he was known for. "Even if these documents are real, Mrs. Carter, that doesn't explain why none of this exists in our records. Our history. Our archives. Because John Lansbury and his partners made sure it didn't," she replied simply. "You think they wanted the town to know that a black woman co-founded the most powerful financial institution in Charleston?" Connor's jaw tensed. The words stung not because they were rude, but because they landed close to a truth he had never questioned. He looked at the surrounding staff. Their eyes were on him, but more importantly, on her. Derek took a step forward again, his hand brushing the gun on his hip out of habit. "This could still be a trick," he muttered. "Old paper. Clever forgeries. You can't trust people who come in off the street." Evelyn turned to him sharply, but she didn't raise her voice. "What you call me doesn't matter. The truth doesn't change because of your fear, or your uniform, or your silence." Derek froze. Her tone wasn't angry, it was grounded. And that made it hit even harder. Connor slowly closed the ledger and looked up at her. For the first time, his eyes no longer carried contempt or disbelief. They held something else: uncertainty. "Why now?" he asked quietly. "Why come back after all these years?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Because I needed to know that I still existed in the story. That the truth couldn't be buried forever just because powerful men didn't want it to be heard." The words seemed to echo through the high-ceilinged bank. Each person in the room stood a little straighter, listened a little harder. The truth was cracking through the marble floors, through the spotless glass, through the legacy of lies that had been polished for decades. And now, nothing would stop it. The lobby of Hawthorne Federal Bank was no longer a place of commerce, it had become a courtroom of conscience. And in the center stood Evelyn May Carter, not with lawyers or banners, but with crumbling documents, yellowed currency, and the quiet certainty of someone who had waited over 5 decades to be heard. The thick ledger sat on the glass service table, open to the page where her signature stood side by side with John Lansbury's. Around her, the crowd watched with suspended breath. Even the most skeptical among them now looked on with wary eyes, unsure whether to hold on to their old assumptions or accept what was unraveling before them. But not everyone was ready to surrender to the truth. Derek Whitmore, the tall security guard, shifted uncomfortably near the front doors. His face twisted with a mix of frustration and disbelief. To him, Evelyn's calm presence was more threatening than a shouting protester. It was a direct challenge to the authority he had always believed he protected. "This is enough," Derek suddenly snapped, his voice rising in the tense air. "This woman is creating a disturbance. She came in here with old papers and a story and expects us to just what? Hand her the deed?" His words cut through the stillness, sharp and jarring. Evelyn turned her head slowly toward him. Her expression remained unchanged, but her eyes, deep, dark, unshaken, locked with his in a silence that said more than words ever could. "I'm not here to steal anything," she said softly. "I'm here to reclaim what was stolen from me." Derek's hand moved once again to his sidearm, the gesture slow but unmistakable. The metallic click of the holster's snap echoed through the marble lobby. Several customers flinched. A mother instinctively stepped in front of her teenage son. The mood darkened. At the counter, Connor Hastings held up his hand. "Derek. Stand down." But the guard didn't move. "Connor," Derek said, his voice laced with irritation, "you're really going to let this woman walk in here, accuse the Lansbury family of fraud, claim she founded the bank, and put all of us at risk just because of some dusty documents?" Connor hesitated. The weight of his silence stretched too long. Evelyn stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the grace of someone who had long since shed the need to seek permission. "I walked into this building with the truth," she said. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand anything. But the moment I spoke, you tried to remove me. You mocked me. You reached for your weapon. And yet I'm the one being called a threat." Her words dropped like heavy stones, one after another. Derek's hand faltered slightly. His eyes scanned the room. For the first time, the customers weren't rallying behind him. Instead, they stared at him. Some with concern, others with growing disapproval. Near the counter, Emily Rivera, a young teller known for keeping quiet, took a cautious step forward. She picked up one of the old bills Evelyn had brought, yellowed, folded, marked with the original Hawthorne Bank seal, and used since the early 60s. Emily looked at it for a long moment, then placed it gently beside the ledger on the table. "I believe her," she said, her voice soft but clear. "This money, it's real. The seal, the texture, it's not fake." The ripple was immediate. Another employee, Josh Bryant, stepped forward. He too picked up a document and placed it before Evelyn. "And I'm sorry," he said, glancing at her with eyes filled with quiet regret. "For laughing. For not seeing what was right in front of us." Within moments, 2 more tellers followed. Each one picked up a piece of Evelyn's evidence and placed it gently on the table. No speeches. No hashtags. Just truth being acknowledged finally. Derek stood frozen, disbelief written across his face. Connor cleared his throat, his voice lower now. "Mrs. Carter, may I?" She nodded, and he carefully lifted the original ledger again. He flipped further into the pages. The deeper he went, the worse it got. No signatures from Evelyn on any transfer of ownership. No formal relinquishment of her shares. Just John Lansbury's name, appearing again and again, and eventually, the Lansbury family, consolidating everything. Connor's fingers trembled. "This," he whispered. "This should have never been hidden." Evelyn looked at him not triumphantly, but with quiet weariness. But it was. A heavy silence returned. It was the silence that follows realization. The kind that comes when a truth, long buried, surfaces and can no longer be denied, not by papers, not by position, and certainly not by fear. And in that silence, the foundation of everything they thought they knew began to shake. The atmosphere inside Hawthorne Federal Bank had changed. What had begun as ridicule and scorn had now grown into something far more fragile: awareness. The quiet weight of Evelyn May Carter's truth hovered over the marble floors, whispering through the high ceilings like a long-forgotten hymn finally being sung. For a moment, everything stood still until Emily Rivera, the youngest teller on staff, stepped forward. She walked slowly, carefully, her heels echoing softly on the tile. In her trembling hands, she held one of the brittle banknotes Evelyn had presented, a faded $50 bill bearing the original Hawthorne Bank crest, and used for over half a century. With the solemnity of someone offering a token at a grave, she gently placed the bill on the table next to the open ledger and looked into Evelyn's eyes. "I trust you, Miss Carter," she said. Her voice was soft but resolute, echoing across the stunned lobby. "We've lived in lies long enough. It's time we faced the truth." The room went still. Even Derek Whitmore, still near the entrance, didn't speak. He watched Emily's simple act with a clenched jaw and darting eyes, as if his carefully constructed world was cracking and he didn't yet know how to stop it. Evelyn's eyes misted, but she didn't cry. She nodded once, slowly, offering a look that held lifetimes of gratitude. Then, without prompting, Josh Bryant, the teller who had once mocked her, stepped forward too. His face red with embarrassment, he picked up another old bill, walked it to the front, and laid it down beside Emily's. "I was wrong," he murmured, eyes cast downward. "I laughed when I should have listened." He didn't look for forgiveness. He just stood silently beside her. Then came Mark, Trina, Amir, one after another. Some employees had once whispered mockingly. Now, they approached quietly, each selecting a faded note or document, and placing it before Evelyn like offerings of respect. None of them spoke, but each step forward was a step away from silence and complicity. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't dramatic. It was something more dangerous to injustice, a moral awakening. Each quiet act formed a ripple that rolled across the marble lobby, overtaking fear, melting away suspicion, and turning shame into action. Evelyn stood among them, surrounded now by the very people who had once doubted her. Her face showed no pride, no gloating, just a quiet, exhausted peace, like someone who had wandered a desert for decades and finally seen water. But in the far corner of the room, Derek Whitmore hadn't moved. His hand still rested on the leather holster at his hip, white-knuckled and tense. His breathing was heavier now, not from exertion, but from the internal war being waged behind his eyes. He watched as more employees joined the silent gesture of solidarity, their actions chipping away at the fortress of certainty he'd built around himself. His worldview had been one of order, one where uniforms meant control, and where power was always right. But now, everything around him was slipping. Derek's jaw tightened. He took a step forward, his boots thudding more loudly this time. His eyes locked on Evelyn, not with violence, but with disbelief, confusion, and a deep fear of losing his place in the world. "She just walked in here," he said, voice louder now, more strained. "No appointment. No court order. Just claims. And you're all falling in line. You're betraying everything we've built for someone with papers and a story." His voice cracked at the edges, not rage, but desperation. No one answered. Because no one needed to. The truth was already too loud to ignore. Connor Hastings stepped forward again, standing between Derek and the growing group behind Evelyn. "Derek," he said quietly, "you need to look around. This isn't about what we built. This is about what we buried to build it." Derek didn't reply. His eyes flicked between Evelyn, the ledger, the faded bills, and the staff who once worked under his silent authority, now standing against everything he thought he represented. He stepped back, just once. His hand left the holster. The ripple had reached him too. And though he hadn't moved toward the table, he had finally moved. The quiet solidarity that had slowly unfolded across the lobby of Hawthorne Federal Bank now hovered like a second skin on every surface, palpable, unshakable. The elegant stillness wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm that had taken 50 years to brew, and Evelyn May Carter was its center. The old banknotes lay on the glass table like relics. The open ledger remained where Connor Hastings had placed it, page spread like a wound that refused to close. And behind that table, the bank staff, those who had once smirked, sneered, or stayed silent, now stood in a quiet row behind Evelyn, like a newly formed line of defense. But it was not over. Far from it. Near the doors, Derek Whitmore still stood rigid, hand having just fallen away from the grip of his sidearm. Though his posture no longer screamed open threat, his eyes remained stormy, wounded with disbelief. The kind of disbelief not born from lack of evidence but from the slow collapse of a world someone once thought was immovable. For Derek, this wasn't just about a woman with documents. It was about his entire belief system crumbling in real time. In his mind, banks were institutions. Institutions stood for law, order, and stability. Evelyn Carter's truth had fractured that image, and worse, the people around him were starting to accept it. He couldn't. Not yet. "I don't believe this," Derek muttered through clenched teeth, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We're just going to let her walk in here and rewrite history." His voice cracked with frustration, not conviction. And no one answered. Across the room, Connor Hastings, once the bank's impenetrable voice of order, stood frozen. His spine remained straight, but his hands trembled as he gently closed the century-old ledger that still burned in his palms like a live coal. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the staff. And then he looked up toward the ceiling, as if expecting divine intervention or perhaps, wishing this moment could vanish. But it wouldn't. Connor was the manager. The one who had spent a career building his reputation on decisions, not emotions. He'd given speeches about growth, led diversity workshops, signed off on annual reports boasting of the bank's inclusive history. Yet here he was, holding the physical proof that all of it was built on a lie. And now everyone was watching him. The customers in the lobby, the staff behind him, even the security cameras perched in corners. The moment called for a choice, and that choice was no longer about documents. It was about identity. Who was Connor Hastings really? He cleared his throat. His voice came out tight, uncertain. "I need to verify everything," he said finally. "These are serious accusations. If what you're saying is true, Mrs. Carter, then this bank's entire legal foundation would be called into question." Evelyn didn't flinch. Her voice was tired, but razor-sharp. "You don't need more time. You already know the truth. The signatures are there. The dates match. My name is in that book. You're not verifying anything. You're deciding whether to face it." Connor blinked. It was like her words had cracked through his skull and exposed something raw inside. "I have responsibilities," he muttered. "To my board. To our clients. To the Lansbury legacy." "There is no legacy," Evelyn cut in, firm but not unkind. "Only theft dressed in expensive suits." A long, sharp silence followed. One of the customers, an older woman in pearls and a mauve blazer, slowly stepped forward. "I've banked here since the 70s, she said, voice shaking with emotion. "I've never heard your name, ma'am. But I also never thought to ask." Evelyn nodded slightly. "They made sure you didn't." Connor's breath caught in his throat. Every second stretched like it might snap. His role, his power, his identity as a trusted face of Hawthorne Bank, all of it balanced on a blade. And in that moment, he felt the weight of conscience press against the spine of authority. He knew the Lansbury family wouldn't stand for this. Not quietly. Their name wasn't just engraved on the cornerstone of the building, it was wired into the financial arteries of Charleston. They owned property, sat on university boards, funded mayors, had private foundations. If he accepted Evelyn's claims, even conditionally, he wouldn't just be risking his position. He'd be declaring open war on the legacy that paid his salary. And they would retaliate. Connor turned toward the front windows, where the bright midday sun poured in. Outside, Charleston looked the same. Brick sidewalks. Spanish moss in the trees. Pedestrians passing by without a clue that inside, the ground was shifting. Then he looked back at Evelyn. And saw not an old woman, but a survivor. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't stormed in with cameras or protest signs. She had walked through the front doors with the truth in her hands and had stood, unshaken, as her dignity was questioned in front of strangers. Connor swallowed. "This could cost me everything," he said quietly. Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice was low, but full of fire. "It already cost me everything. My business. My reputation. My name. I buried my own story because no one would hear it." She paused. "But today you did." The staff behind her stayed silent, but the weight of their presence was loud. Connor slowly closed his eyes, exhaled, then reopened them. "If I support you, if I go to the board with this, they'll come after me. Then let them, Evelyn said simply. You can be remembered as the man who defended a lie, or the one who finally told the truth. Connor turned away, pacing now, one hand pressed against his mouth. His thoughts raced, the legal liability. The press. The Matthews family. The possibility of losing everything. His entire career had been built on caution. And this moment was anything but safe. Then a voice broke the stillness. It was Emily Rivera. If you stand by her, Mr. Hastings, you won't be standing alone. Connor turned. Emily looked small, barely out of college, still unsure of herself in most things, but in this moment, her voice rang with something unshakable. Josh added, we'll back you. Whatever comes next. More murmurs of support followed. Mark, Trina, even Amir, who had said nothing since the beginning, stepped forward. Behind them, some customers began to nod, slowly, reluctantly. The tide was turning. Connor looked around the room and realized something terrifying and exhilarating at once. He was no longer in control. But maybe that wasn't a failure. Maybe it was the beginning of something honest. He walked over to the table. Picked up the ledger. Looked at Evelyn. I'll report this, he said, voice steady. I'll bring it to the board, to legal. Everything. I won't hide it. But you need to be prepared for what's coming. Evelyn nodded. I've lived through worse than threats. Connor hesitated, then reached for the intercom on the wall. With one press, his voice echoed through the entire building, all senior staff, please report to the main lobby. This is not a drill. We are addressing a historical discrepancy regarding bank ownership and institutional records. All employees are to pause client services until further notice. The silence afterward was deafening. Derek shook his head in disbelief. You're serious? Connor turned to him. Yes. I am. Derek's voice dropped into a growl. The Lansburys will destroy you. Connor replied without blinking. Then let them come. And with that, the lobby of Hawthorne Federal Bank stood transformed not by violence, not by outrage, but by the silent, collective decision of people who had chosen truth over tradition. Evelyn looked at Connor, her eyes full of something deeper than relief. Respect. And for the first time in decades, she no longer stood alone. The lobby of Hawthorne Federal Bank had never known a silence so thick, so complete. Not even during after-hours or Sunday closings. It was the silence of realization. The silence that comes when foundations shift and no one knows if the ground beneath their feet will ever feel the same again. Evelyn May Carter stood near the front desk, hands folded in front of her, as the ripple of truth she had unleashed continued to spread. The old ledger sat beside her like a relic recovered from the depths of time, its ink faded but undeniable, its story raw and irreversible. Moments earlier, Connor Hastings, the bank manager, had spoken through the intercom, suspending operations, halting transactions, and calling in every senior staff member to confront the story head-on. Now, the hush was pierced only by the sound of footsteps approaching from the administrative wing, heels clicking, loafers scuffing on marble, doors opening slowly as summoned employees stepped into the aftermath. They came out one by one, executives, compliance officers, assistants, each of them pausing in confusion at the sight of the unusual scene. The employees lined up silently beside Evelyn, the ledger laid open on the counter, and Connor standing in front of her like a sentinel, guarding a truth he could no longer ignore. "What's going on?" asked Marcia Liddell, the bank's director of risk and a longtime loyalist to the Lansbury legacy. She eyed Evelyn with visible suspicion. Connor didn't look away. "We're addressing a historic ownership claim, one that challenges the founding narrative of this bank." Marcia frowned. "What kind of claim?" Evelyn answered for him. "I am the co-founder of this bank. My name was erased, my contributions stolen, and my story buried beneath a pile of lies designed to silence me. But the documents are here. The proof is real. And it's time to reckon with it." Gasps and whispers broke out among the new arrivals. Marcia stepped closer to the table, glancing at the faded documents. "You can't be serious," she said, flipping a page with a little too much force. This would mean the entire ownership structure of Hawthorne Bank is compromised." "It was compromised the moment they removed me," Evelyn replied. The words hit like a hammer, measured, grounded, irreversible. Connor took a breath and stood tall. "We're not hiding it. I'm submitting all these documents to legal review immediately. And I'll be bringing the full report to the Board of Governors before week's end." One of the junior directors stammered, "Do you know what the Lansburys will do when they hear this?" "I do," Connor said, his voice calm. "But they don't own the truth. Not anymore." Across the lobby, Emily Rivera quietly stepped closer to Evelyn. She wasn't holding a document this time, only a folded linen cloth, which she offered with both hands. "I thought this would be better to protect the ledger," she said softly. Evelyn accepted it with trembling fingers. For a second, her eyes shimmered not with sadness, but with a tenderness born from finally being seen. She gently wrapped the ledger, pressing it close to her chest like something sacred. One by one, customers who had once stood in judgment now moved aside for her, offering small nods of acknowledgement. A woman who had clutched her purse in fear earlier now whispered, "I'm sorry." A middle-aged man in work boots removed his baseball cap, pressing it to his chest like he might at a funeral or a battlefield. This wasn't just the end of an injustice. It was the resurrection of a legacy. The camera feed in the lobby captured it all. Connor would later download the footage and include it in his report to the board. But even without video, every person in that room would carry the image forever, the moment a woman erased from history stood in the light of it and claimed her place back. As Evelyn turned to leave, her bag lighter now, her shoulders straighter, the automatic glass doors slid open once more. Sunlight poured in warm, golden, soft against the polished marble. She paused at the threshold. For decades, she had only dreamed of this exit not as retreat, but as release. She had come to reclaim what was hers. She had come to speak truth in a temple built on lies. And she had done it. With one final glance behind her, Evelyn looked at Connor. Their eyes met, his red rimmed from the weight of what he had just chosen, hers glowing with quiet pride. He gave a small, reverent nod. Evelyn returned it. And then she stepped out into the street. Outside, the world kept moving. Cars passed. Pedestrians hustled by. Birds chirped in the trees that lined the sidewalks of Charleston. But for Evelyn, it felt different now, like a layer had been lifted from the air. As though the city had finally breathed a word it had kept locked away for far too long. Behind her, inside the bank, things were already shifting. Connor turned to his staff. "We'll be preparing a full report. Everything she brought stays here. Under lock and chain. No one touches it without my clearance." "What about the press?" someone asked. "They'll hear about it soon enough," he said. Emily whispered, "You really think they'll let this go to the board?" "No," Connor said. "They won't. But they won't be able to bury it either. Not this time." Far away, in the offices of the Lansbury Trust, phones would begin to ring. The emails would come. Lawyers would be dispatched. Statements would be drafted. But none of it could undo the moment that had just occurred in that lobby. A woman they had tried to erase had just rewritten the ending. In the weeks that followed, the story of Evelyn May Carter spread like wildfire. First through local blogs, then newspapers, then national media. Headlines flashed across every platform: "Black woman erased from bank's history comes forward with proof and it shakes a city's legacy." Legal proceedings were launched. Historians reached out. Families in Charleston whispered about what else had been buried. But more importantly, people listened. And Evelyn? She didn't seek money. She didn't demand a title. She only asked for one thing: put my name where it always belonged. On the cornerstone. The board would argue. The Lansburys would resist. But eventually, Even they couldn't deny the mounting wave of evidence and public pressure. Within 6 months, a bronze plaque was installed outside Hawthorne Federal Bank. It read, "In honor of Evelyn May Carter, co-founder, 1962 visionary, pioneer, and keeper of truth." On the day it was unveiled, Evelyn stood quietly with her hands folded behind her back, surrounded by a crowd of strangers and supporters who had become family. Connor stood beside her. So did Emily. So did Josh. And as the sun gleamed off the polished bronze, Evelyn smiled, not the smile of triumph, but of peace. She had finally been heard. And her story, once erased, would never be forgotten again. What did we learn from Evelyn May Carter's story? That truth may be delayed, but it is never destroyed. For over 50 years, a woman was silenced not by force but by systems built to make her invisible. But all it took was one act of courage, and everything changed. This story teaches us one unshakable truth: you don't need power to make history. You need persistence. In a world where injustice often hides behind polished walls and prestigious names, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to forget. Refuse to look away. Refuse to stay silent. If you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or erased, Evelyn's story is your reminder. Your voice is your legacy. And your truth is your weapon. So here's what you can do right now: comment, "I will not be erased," if this story moved you. Share this video to remind someone that silence is never the final chapter. And subscribe to this channel, because we're not done uncovering the stories that were never meant to be told. Remember, they can bury your name, but they can't bury your truth.